Yes, welcome back. It's nice to see that all of you were chatting so intensely. There will be more opportunity to chat during the lunch, but now I suggest that we get started with the final interactive panel discussion. And the topic, as you can see there, is Europe and peace in the world. In the program, it says that Ursula Schröder would be the moderator. I am not Ursula Schröder, but I'm Jorg Kustermans from the University of Antwerp, and I'm stepping in for Ursula because she could not attend ultimately the conference. Lisa Musiol is on her way. She sent a message some 20 minutes ago that she would try to be here sharp on time, but that didn't work out yet. And the sharpness will never work out anymore because that's too late. But I'm very happy that I can introduce to you Marko Lehti of the Tampere Peace Research Institute, where you are the research director. And Marko also runs or at least chairs the MA program in peace, mediation and conflict, mediation, peace and conflict at the University of Tampere. And so he will be talking, and then Lisa from the International Crisis Group can hopefully join us as well when the panel is underway. The context of this panel, Europe and peace in the world, is the war in Ukraine, actually. So that is the background against which we want to discuss Europe and peace in the world. The background against which we want to discuss the viability, maybe, of the European Union as a peace project, which at the very least is part of its self-understanding. Right? And so, great. Glad that you made it. No worries. I was simply doing the introduction, so you're just on time. So this is Lisa, and Lisa is the head of EU affairs at the International Crisis Group. I was saying that the idea of this session is that we discuss Europe as a peace project in the context of the war in Ukraine. And the way that I thought about it in preparing this discussion is that there are two dimensions at least, right? The one is that the European Union is or at least is often considered to be a zone of peace, right? So there is peace within Europe. European Union stands as one of the most prominent examples of a so-called security community where there is a dependable expectation of peaceful change. So that is one dimension. And then the other dimension is that Europe wants to be a force for peace also in the world beyond Europe. That's part of its idea, that's part of its project as well, at least allegedly. Both of these dimensions raise questions, I would say. So the EU as a zone of peace raises the question whether the war in Ukraine threatens the EU as a zone of peace. And it also raises the question whether the events that are unfolding, whether they shed new light on what sustains the European Union as a zone of peace, or what sustains the European Union as a zone of peace. When we think about the EU as a force for peace, so an actor that wants to foster peace in the outside world, the war in Ukraine leads to or invites a reassessment of the EU's standing as a force for peace in the world beyond Europe. A couple of questions that come to mind is like, should the war in Ukraine influence the kinds of programs that it implements, the kinds of tools that it uses when it seeks to act as a force for peace? Another question that comes to mind is whether the war in Ukraine will influence the legitimacy of the European Union to act as a force for peace in the world beyond Europe. And then a final question that at least came to my mind is how the war in Ukraine has an effect on how it takes up its role as a force of peace, and whether that role ought to be embedded in a broader institutional context, in a broader multilateral context, and which kind of organizations then might be cooperated with more intensely. So these are the questions that came to my mind, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Marko first to address these questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And a very good question, and great to be here. And hopefully we get the continuation of this meeting. Also, this was very much needed on all these. And it's a very good day if I make a kind of a question about the Europe as a peace process. So Europe today, and it's already defining how the Europe as a peace process is seen, and how Europe today is kind of seen, how it divided the Europe also. I think it's seen differently in different places of Europe. And if you go beyond on the European Union all the way to Russia, it's celebrating as a Victorious Day, which is actually not the peace day, but the kind of honoring the dignity of state and its power of that. I think that both issues, the European capacity and capability to promote the peace globally, and how it cope with its own kind of war in heart of Europe, are very much connected. And that's why it's starting on my thinking, and that's what is going on, and how perhaps we go further on, and perhaps there will be some continuation of Europe as a zone of peace, which is in great doubt and very much contested at the moment. We have used to think about that the Europe peace process is a kind of process against our evil past, that we were solving that what happened in Second World War and all kind of things that never happened. But is also very much kind of more perhaps a Western European experiences than shared in North or Eastern part of the European Union. But what you're already pointing out, I think that is the most important here in the thing about the zone of peace is a security commodity, or peace commodity, as I look like the trust for peaceful change of all possible conflicts come out. And I think that has been completely kind of disappeared, at least in certain part of Europe. We were living in a belief that the wars were somewhere else, and not in Europe. And if you look about how we think of that in North, in Finland, or in the Nordics, or in Baltic states, in Poland, Romania, that trust has been gone. And a very trusting sense that's, I remember how much has been said that the wars are not coming like they were in the Second World War and First World War. And I think that was so wrong, that all wars are coming in kind of asymmetric wars, but we have a kind of very massive interstate war in heart of Europe. So what we're wrong is a question of that. I think that the one thing is which we missed to discuss much, we could have discussed earlier and also in peace process communities, is this classic Eho Kaas question, how the peace systems can address the kind of aggressive authoritarian, totalitarian system they are bordering, how they can tame them. We have, of course, an ideas how these liberal projects tame the Russia, but we perhaps failed, but that should be taken much more seriously. And that we have to return on that question, because I think that peace systems always are kind of bordering a more aggressive system. There are also another value systems with which we have to cope with this, and hopefully we can cope again with the peaceful terms in long-term perspective. We need to create agnostic systems within the Europe. Then coming back on question of Ukraine and the continuation of the Europe as a peace processes, I think here is a very crucial question, how the European Union is taking position here, how we dealing with the Ukrainian membership kind of enlargement issue. Is it understanding as a peace process, a continuation peace process, extraordinary measuring kind of thing, or is it taking as a kind of a normal continuation of bureaucratic kind of criteria checking and the kind of thinking? I think here we are kind of choosing between, are we somehow emphasizing giving right for the kind of colonial imperial elements in the European kind of conditions? Are we coming more again pushing of these peace egalitarian processes further on? And then here we are living in turning points, and hopefully that is being very seriously discussed throughout the Europe. If you think about quickly in how this is influencing on Europe's capacity and capability of promote the peace in globally, I already say that we are changing between perhaps a kind of colonial and a kind of a more egalitarian democratic views And that's leading it's really kind of a paradox at the moment that's how we are in Europe, a very large scale colonial war. And I call it the Russian war against Ukraine as a colonial war. It is imperial war. It is a war against the liberal West also. It's all of them. At the same time, this is seen throughout the global South as a kind of a more as a kind of a war against the colonial West and Russia is using a lot of its power of influencing of this narrative, and it resonates, of course, with all strong kind of West anti-liberal kind of tendencies throughout them. And how we can cope with these kind of tendencies is, I think, there is a European kind of legitimacy or credibility as actors is on a case. So and then Europe have not a good reputation of the coping with all kind of a decolonial contestation. It's bitten staying too much on the liberal side, and maybe again European Union is losing more its legitimacy, its credibility as actor on these, and the world is more and more divided in different, not exclusive orders, but perhaps different systems with different kind of normative paces of building peace, and the room for the European Union is become narrow and narrow. But to say that kind of one last thing is that how I think that Europe is still able and have a capacity also to be kind of a global influential change maker is that its own larger peace ecosystem this is there in the European Union. That's make it unique. There's not a European Union only making, there's not only states who making, there are very large non-profit sector making peace building. And that makes the European Union kind of action in peace building and peace mediation more flexible, more adaptive. And there the European actors can adapting on different kind of roles and entering on different kind of situations. And that is still taking place. And this is there adapting even at the same time, perhaps the criticism towards the former European Union policies become stronger and stronger. And I here say that, yeah, but I stop here.
Thank you, Marko. Not overly optimistic, but a slight moment of hope at the very end. Lisa.
Sure. And let me apologize again for arriving late. It makes my German heart bleed to be late. I just had a bit of a crazy morning, but in my defense, I just stayed just about in the academic 15 minutes, right? But no, so really apologies. I didn't mean to arrive too late. But so on the different questions, I think you laid out very well the different dimensions of that we have to look at when it comes to the impact that the war in Ukraine has on the questions around Europe, peace and Europe. So I'll go through them, and we've been asked to also look a little bit at what role peace research specifically can play in all of these areas. So I'll try to tackle that a little bit as well, and following, of course, the good comments from the colleague. So I think, first of all, looking at the EU itself and the role that the EU has played, I would say that the war in Ukraine has, to some extent, also given a certain sense of purpose for the EU again, in the sense of demonstrating again how important it is to have a European bloc that has been for so many decades provided peace in its own territory. Now, of course, we do have the war in Ukraine, but as the EU project as such, it is quite remarkable after the world wars that we've seen on the continent that most disputes are in the EU itself are being settled peacefully, and that this has been maybe taken for granted for a while, but now we see how important it is and what the EU project and the integration of the EU and everything that has come with it is also brought to the EU and to the citizens. And it will be important to sort of see what are the factors that are making the EU still being a territory where we have not seen any large scale sort of confrontation and violence potentially. And looking at what are the factors, looking at some of the peace agreements that still exist within the EU that might be on on sort of shaky grounds or the areas where we know the Northern Ireland peace process, for example, the Good Friday Agreement, it's never something you should take for granted, but to see how is that process looking? How is it affected also by sort of changes within the EU, Brexit, etc. So there's still a lot of research, I would say, that is needed on why the EU has been a successful peace project in itself. And sort of reinvigorating this and sort of realizing how much this should not be taken for granted, and looking at the EU's own internal tensions that might exist, and making sure that they don't break out, and that, again, this stays a peaceful union ultimately. Then we look at the war in Ukraine. Of course, as you rightly mentioned, it has completely shaken up sort of some of the sense of broader security in Europe, noticing that the kind of the realization that we have a large-scale war on the European continent again. And there is a lot for the EU to navigate in the sense of supporting Ukraine because of for the existential reasons that the EU has in supporting Ukraine, but at the same time not being drawn into this war directly, and not being drawn into a direct confrontation with Russia. So that is a very careful balancing act that the EU is managing to a certain extent, and it is not easy. So I think there's also a lot of elements there in terms of figuring out how the EU can continue to support Ukraine as much as possible, but without actually becoming a direct party to the war. That is something where I think we need to still look much further, and continue also further down the line as there's no end to the war in sight. The other element, I think, where also peace research will be particularly important is all the questions around what a potential peace in Ukraine can and will eventually look like. That's, of course, a very politically very difficult question to raise. We as Crisis Group, we're a conflict prevention organization and a conflict resolution organization, we see how hard it can be to even raise these kind of questions around a potential political settlement, given how politically sensitive it is. So for researchers and peace research who sort of can look at this from a sort of a relatively neutral perspective, I would say there's a really important mandate also to think through these things, help also policymakers think through some of these questions of what, where this is going, and how we can ultimately find a relatively sustainable peace that is, or at least, let's say, political settlement, not that is acceptable to Ukraine, and how to get there. And these are very difficult questions, very political, and I think that's where especially peace research will be needed. And I've heard even from some researchers who have been trying to look at sort of examples of peace research, of peace deals elsewhere, and seeing what can be applied in Ukraine, and even just asking these questions to certain interlocutors. They already receive sort of pushback, and what are you talking about, etc. So it's become even, I'd be interested also to hear experience from the colleagues who are involved in this, but it has become even difficult sometimes to do this academic work without it becoming politicized. And I think that's something we all have to sort of be aware of. Then looking at the EU's policies as such, I think you hinted at that as well, something to watch when we see how the EU reacted to the war in Ukraine in terms of foreign policy, and in terms of the steps that the EU has taken, really unprecedented leaps that we would have been really unthinkable just a bit more than a year ago. That also opens up a lot of questions around what does that mean for EU for foreign policy elsewhere. We have seen the largest ever economic sanctions that the EU has imposed on any third party. Opens a lot of questions on how are sanctions actually being used? Are they used just as a punishment, sort of as a punishment, or as a way to reduce Russia's war capabilities, or are they also being used somehow strategically to move towards an ultimate political settlement. We don't necessarily see the latter at the moment. It seems to be sort of more just adding sanctions as they go, but not really thinking strategically of how they can be used in a way that can ultimately lead to sort of or be part of a political settlement in the end. Questions around that. Other questions, of course, the large-scale military support that the EU has now provided to Ukraine. We have seen the use now of the European Peace Facility as an instrument that the EU has used to pay for the lethal equipment and the equipment of arms and now also ammunition for Ukraine. 2 years ago, we didn't even have the European Peace Facility. So this is something completely new territory for the EU as such. There's a lot of questions of how is this support being provided? What potential safeguards are there? What precedents is it setting for the EU's use of becoming more of a sort of a military provider? And how do we assess that? Going forward, especially also when we look at sort of other conflict theaters, do we see more appetite for the EU to also play a stronger military role and build stronger military partnerships elsewhere? And what does that mean? I think is also a lot of questions around it. The accession questions, of course, as well. You mentioned it. Is something which the EU has now been using as a tool to support Ukraine, support Moldova, help with political messaging as well as integration into the better integration into the EU, even short of sort of becoming full member. A lot of things are already happening when it comes to the integration into the European Union. And what does it mean for EU accession policy more broadly? Is this becoming more political or not? There's a lot of research needed on that. So I think there's quite a lot of questions around EU foreign policy, big changes that we are seeing, and trying to figure out where are we heading with that? What are the difficult questions, the difficult trade-offs that need to be addressed as well? Then on the role of peace, the EU's role elsewhere. I think as one thing that we see as crisis group is that the EU is looking at different conflicts and crises in the world often very strongly now through the lens of its confrontation with Russia. So that is really sometimes sort of blindsiding and sort of not paying attention to some of the other local dynamics that are really at play in a different conflict on the ground. It's sometimes really giving disproportionate attention to the Russia factor, if you want, in a given conflict theater. And I think there's a lot of work that we as Crisis Group are trying to do, and I think just generally peace research should do, is really helping unpack what are the actual dynamics that are at play at a conflict, and sort of making sure that the EU in all its foreign policy has a good understanding of the conflicts that are happening and is not just seeing it through a very one-sided lens of its competition with Russia. It's always interesting when our colleagues from different conflicts across the world are coming to Brussels and get all these questions of what is the role of Russia in this context, and they're always so surprised because they say it's really not the sort of the key factor that is driving a conflict, and it shouldn't be so much shouldn't get as much attention as it does. And another, lastly, I think something that you have also covered, and I think really important, where we need to think much more about, and is, what the EU's role in the world really, right? The fact that the EU has been taking this stance in support of Ukraine, has been has been sort of pushing other countries across the globe to also side with the so-called West, to condemn Russia, to isolate Russia. It has really created also a lot of friction with many countries across the globe who felt that the EU didn't really see sort of their perspective, their reasons for acting in a certain way, to position themselves in a certain way, and ultimately the EU potentially being not seen sort of as much as a neutral player, as we've seen maybe a couple of years ago, the EU was obviously never neutral as such, but we might see sort of a shift away, which can again affect potentially how the EU can mediate in certain conflicts and so on. We have seen some positive signs where the EU, especially in its neighborhood, has taken on a mediation role. Kosovo, Serbia, they have become more active in trying to bring about normalization. Armenia, Azerbaijan, the EU has also tried to do to broker or to at least de-escalate tensions. The efforts have sort of died down a little bit, maybe, or have stalled, let's say. But so we see that is still happening, but maybe broader outside of the sort of more Eastern European or sort of the broader EU neighborhood, there's maybe more questions of how the EU is being perceived and what that means for their role potentially in helping settle conflicts. So I stop there.
I think Marko wants to.
Yeah.
And then we
I
take it to
want
the
to come
audience.
before we open up the discussion about the not discussion about so much about European just but about the peace research, about what we can do as a peace researcher at this moment. And I think that that's an issue you already given for us certain kind of a role, which are not perhaps all of them even agree but in a certain way. But I think it's been very kind of a difficult situation, at least personally for me, and actually not kind of experiencing emotionally not any other conflict as strongly, and it's so difficult to take any kind of very strong objective position in that. It's so coming close. Perhaps it's my own kind of position that we see in Finland that is so kind of in seeing that it could happen for us, or also in certain way, and you're seeing that. But I think that is a really important question, and I've been in meeting that in several times during the past year, and there've been a lot of questions, and also we need to see that why we are not seeing too much in the media, why it's also security people, military people are there commenting. Well, that's because of a certain kind of a media policies also, but it's also that when they gave a question how this war comes end, how you can mediate this conflict. I don't know. I have been kind of a lot of making books about the mediation, I've been studying about mediation. But there comes an issue. Yeah, I can say that this kind of small step make it kind of open something, but not come see this. The things which we have learned from other kind of conflicts, mostly asymmetric conflicts, interested conflicts, doesn't work in this context. So that's it. It's the one thing that we have to think that this is a major interstate conflict in a very different kind of a conflict. And I think that they have three learnings what we think about, in my opinion, we should think about in peace research. The first is that well, not all what we have learned to discuss about in case of kind of a peace building, peace mediation, can it be not putting in Ukraine conflict. Some of them are very relevant, but not all of them. We have to think about also how it's unique, how it is actually game changer, or is it a game changer? But I'm thinking it's a game changer in larger scale. All conflicts have an importance, so they have a change in some norms, but this is maybe a bit differently. But actually, which kind of a mediation, which kind of peace building issues can add up there? Not and that's another point which came up with discussing peace and conflict research is that the peace and conflict research has not very much been interested about Eastern Europe. The interest has been very much in global South and kind of beyond, but somehow the Eastern Europe being a bit of blind spot on that. They are, but not as much. And well, if you broaden up the picture to the international relations studies, for example, here at least is also can be a point that we can even criticize that we can ask to decolonizing of the Western international relations studies. It's actually seen too much in a long period of things from through the Russian eyes and Russian interpretations, giving too much saying that they are the great powers as a kind of a bigger sovereignty and see the kind of a certain justified reason which we have to respect in certain level. Even look about classical international relations. Because the peace and conflict studies have not too much a kind of written about the Eastern European issue, I would say that is perhaps not the same issue there, but also what we need to now do is really respect an Ukrainian, why not other Moldovan, Georgian kind of agency also in research, in kind of engaging then in discussion about the future of Europe, engaging on them, discussing what the peace is, not only all the indeed about discussing about Russia, but the given agency. Another thing in here when is that I think it's highly important. When we think about what then we can do, we should step over on this discussion. If you have an answer that how the war can be end and how to mediate it, that's fine, and please share it with us immediately. But we think about also a bit over on that in all wars comes to end in some form. Maybe there's just a weak ceasefire, maybe there are some kind of agreement in first place, but we have to think about years ahead. We have to think about the kind of a decades ahead. The European level peace systems, which was built around OSCE, which was meant to be at least security commodity building organization, it's gone, it's dead. And we mentioned that in yesterday already, that was say that almost dead, but could I say we have to recreate it. We have to create the systems, and there we needed creative power, we needed policy, but we needed creative energy of the discussion that. And another thing which we needed, I think that the Peace Research Committee is very relevant, is the kind of rising importance of civil society, bottom-up thinking, that the peace, even it's a kind of a major war between two big states, the peace will not come only by agreeing between the two states or making kind of a larger kind of a peace agreement between certain quarantine kind of actors who great powers, so NATO, EU guarantee the peace. It's also the peace always comes from bottom up, that we needed to understand that also in these cases, engaging kind of a civil society actors is important to building on sustainable peace in long-term perspective. And already I think the medical is referring very strongly the kind of a strong civil society in Ukraine, how the war is created even more this kind of interactive, very diverse kind of civil society activity and strengthening of the society there. And that I think that should not be forgotten when we're discussing how we build also peace. Now it's been there for building resistance and a resilience of Ukrainian nation, but that will be a seed for the peace also.
Thank you. What I think we should do is invite some questions from the audience at this point. Ooh.
Thank you so much. I'm a PhD candidate from Tilburg University, the Netherlands, and I've been looking into some of the discourse that members of parliament in European foreign policy display. And what I see is actually to tap into your point on that the EU is struggling with getting support for their needs to respond to the war in Ukraine, because the understanding of the EU as a peace project is not shared as such by other actors. So this perception of the EU as a peaceful actor providing peaceful norms around the world is not experienced as peaceful or as peace for all in that sense. And I'm wondering whether this new trend in armaments or like increased armaments is actually challenging this even more, and whether it would be needed for the EU to be more self-reflective in their role as not a peace actor for all, and that would actually maybe help to gain more support in their actions.
I propose that we collect a few. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I agree with the comments. I agree with the comments made. So it's Owen Green from University of Bradford. I agree with the comments made by the discussants. I mean, so I've got 2 points that I'd like you to respond to. One is EU's concept of itself as a peace actor or a peace building actor. And I mean, I think building on your point, I mean, one thing that never had any credibility around the world was the EU's own idea of itself as a peace actor in the classic peace sense, you know, non-violent, doing all of that stuff. That's just not credible, but neither is it feasible. And to some extent, that's been because the EU hasn't clearly articulated. It's been one of the reasons why EU soft power has declined so much around the world over the last 10 years, that its our own articulation of where its soft power lies is so dissonant with what people are looking for partnership and all of that sort of stuff. But the second issue, and perhaps this is the one which you could respond to more closely, is that as European and our allies, as European states struggle to define quite what is the challenge in Europe in terms of peace building. I mean, I think I personally believe that there's no mediated peace on the Ukrainian, until it represents a gigantic setback for a Russian imperial project in that region. And so that gives a timeline, and it also raises some issues around changes in Russian foreign policy and so on and so forth. So let's put that there. But I suppose watching EU debates, you see a struggle between people that are trying to interpret this, policymakers and advocates who are trying to internalize this as the issues associated with a new Cold War, as opposed to the issues associated with a Munich and a Hitler and all of that. So people are misusing historical analogies really badly in the sense of how to understand the present. So, for example, it's really clear that obviously some elements of the Cold War which relate to the fact that there is an adversarial system in which deterrence plays some role, and therefore you have to have mechanisms for conflict management and conflict prevention between the main actors. That's obviously there. But I notice in a lot of European countries, there's a misunderstanding. Oh, we had a formula for the Cold War, which was détente and which was, and all of that, which, which is much more contestable. Similarly, this is not Hitler, but obviously we have an aggressive war. But this is not an aggressive war around a racist ideology. It's a more traditional imperial war, but souped up in all sorts of different ways. So we need, I think, one task for our community is to engage very actively with those which are trying to frame what the challenge is that this represents, and therefore where the most decisive strategic priorities for positioning the European Union and European institutions are. So one way of refining that, for example, which particularly interests me at the moment, is that clearly the OSCE is the cooperative security structure in Europe, and it is paralyzed because Russia has a veto over the de facto operation of how that works. On the other hand, we don't want to then accept a situation where the only key institutional players are the European Union and NATO. You've got to find some framework in which more cooperative, at least in relation to building security beyond the lines of control in Ukraine. So there's some creative thinking there. Obviously, nobody's going to abolish the OSCE or revise its, decision-making procedures. It's a question of how to innovate to replicate some of the facilities and really useful capacities that the OSCE used to provide, High Commissioner for National Minorities, Conflict Prevention Unit, all of that, but in a framework of loose coalitions, which is inclusive, but doesn't allow a veto by essentially Russia and Belarus. So that's just one focus of that, which is neither a Cold War framework, nor we're dealing with Hitler framework, but it's something else. And that's what I'm throwing to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. There's one more question. We'll take one more question and then we'll get back.
Tom Sauer from the University of Antwerp. I think as a peace experts, we are failing in this war. There's not much societal and political debate here in Europe about the war, certainly not in the mainstream media. Those who are critical to the EU approach, to the NATO approach, the US approach, they do not dare to speak out, or they are not heard. And there are not many peace mediation initiatives coming out of Europe either. So well, it strikes me.
Okay, Lisa, will you go first?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you first of all for the mention of your research, which I think sounds really interesting, especially given that I at least sit here in Brussels, so I do not follow always the sort of national parliamentary debates, and it's really quite interesting to see how things are perceived there. And actually, yeah, the 2 points sort of a bit linked. I guess in some member states we have a very loud political debate about the war in Ukraine, whereas in others not, right? I'd say there would be probably quite a bit of difference as well in how much of an attention and space that the war takes. I presume Finland much more than potentially Spain or maybe even Belgium. I think we really have to also keep that in mind, right? How different this debate looks in different member states. So that kind of research is very interesting. And indeed, there are so many questions I think now about how the EU sees itself that are in flux. when we talk to policymakers here, most of them tell us also, look, we just need to get these things done. There's so much of a, I mean, especially over the last year, there was so much urgency to put these new policies in place, to be able to provide substantive to support Ukraine, that they very much acknowledge as well. We haven't really had the time to think through very well what this all means, right? It's not that anyone has sort of the perfect answer, and I think that's where really sort of we have to put the finger on. These are some of the questions that need to be tackled in terms of defense industry. How much are we ramping up? We see much more EU defense integration, much more spending on defense. And what does that really mean for the EU as an actor, both as sort of in and of itself, and then also sort of at its projection globally? I think there's still a lot of things that haven't been sort of thought through, I think. And then we're really at that moment where after 1 year policies have been put in place, at least on sort of some of the EU side. Of course, things are still going on, but there might be a bit more opening to really think through these things. Sometimes this has to be also done very quietly. When we talk about security architecture, any sort of how that could look like, it's obviously still something that cannot necessarily always be sort of discussed in the open, but I think that needs to happen really. On these historic references, I think in the Economist recently this great mention where they said, especially when it comes to Europe and the world, that Europe and the West see this as a prequel to the Cold War, and the rest of the world sees an entirely new movie. Basically, it's a completely different issue, and sort of being stuck in this kind of Cold War perspective, I think is not very, or the sort of references to the Cold War are probably not very helpful at this stage in time. It is really sometimes, especially in the way the EU sees its outreach to the rest of the world, I think is really sometimes also distorting its understanding of other countries. Often it's sort of seen as we just need to have better arguments to get them on our side in some ways, not recognizing that we are in a much more fragmented multipolar system where a lot of the middle powers, especially Brazil, India, South Africa, have found a space for themselves that they are very comfortable in, that they're using to their own advantage, and that they're not willing to give up anytime soon. And it's not about them not quite having decided whether to be with the West or sort of the Russia bloc, but it's just we are looking at a sort of different dynamic. And I think that's something there's maybe still EU a bit slow to realize that indeed. And I think sometimes these historical references are not very helpful. And on the OSCE, I think that is certainly really interesting. I think the OSCE is even still trying to find small spaces where they can still operate. I think their budget, some of it is blocked, so they have to be extremely creative in the way they are doing things. But it's very positive that there's still, a sense of purpose and a sense of trying to work with what they have. And we as Crisis Group have been very clearly also saying that it will be very important to maintain the OSCE, and as it might ultimately play a role further down the line, even when it comes to this conflict. So it's something to preserve. Of course, alternative structures is also interesting to see what can be there. But I think the OSCE in itself should certainly be maintained and has a role to play. Maybe I stop there. I hope I covered everything, but interesting to hear your perspective.
I think I will give Marko the last word now because we're running a bit over time.
I'll try to be brief. There were great questions and some comments. For the first, I think comments. I think that's yes, we are in a danger, and that's kind of a reality that's European Union is more invested in security and militarizations. But it would not change by denying that, saying that, and say that it's a bad thing, because it's because of the lack of trust for peaceful change, and that experience is so kind of overwhelming, especially in kind of countries in the Nordics, in Baltic state in Poland, not only politicians, but throughout the populations in large. And when you have these kind of experiences that you feel that the war could happen for us in not perhaps there was a kind of a year ago with I think that then thinking about it could happen there in quite soon. But now even you think about it, it's among the potential kind of a threat which was not there. So then, of course, it's obvious that you kind of invest on this kind of see the things through that. And then we have to change it. We have to create it in the systems and returning that. And that it's a long way, but it's not changing that to say it's a bad thing and it's not good. I kind of like that, but it's a long way. Then about the kind of I agree very much on all can see. Also, the history is a very good kind of point because it's making the things understandable, but kind of easily you misunderstood the Munich things that the kind of France and Germany negotiated over the kind of the Ukraine. Is also the Cold War thing that, of course, 1975 is a kind of moment, but perhaps we should think about that, learning something. And Hitler, well, not wanting, but perhaps it's making kind of a thing. Would have then the alliance should make a kind of agreement and earlier. So you can play with the things, but I don't. And then they are in you can call the Russian rhetoric as a genocidal. So you can find this is in a way, but it's a tricky question how we think about the future without using the past elements and not the kind of misusing them. But that's I think we should look much more fresh perspective or the future, because that we don't just need to think about that how this end, but really linking from much. Now it's a similar kind of a moment I was seeing that it was during the Second World War and First World War. During the First World War, there was already a lot of discussion of a League of Nations. It's coming a bit earlier and already that, but that larger discussion was a kind of created a moment for the real League of Nations. And during the Second World War, a lot of discussion about integrations and the theorization that. So we needed a similar kind of a forward-looking discussion for theory-orientated and created on that. Also, very policy-oriented discussion on how we cope with that's an issue. And in the end, perhaps it's good to return a bit the broader global sense that we are referring, how we are part of a globe. I think that many of us have a long time in the certain kind of ideals, certain kind of a way that in which direction the global multi-order should, it would be not anymore this kind of Western-led liberal order, and it would be developed towards much more a multiple, diverse order, and different voices we heard and different kind of accept. Unfortunately, I think this kind of conflicts within Ukraine, with the China and is influencing, seeing that it's becoming much more conflictual. There are much more challenges, and it's not going on necessary on the direction that the liberal-minded peace researchers have wanted to do going on. And that's again the saying that we have to study that, but also working and making kind of aware that at the same time when we're discussing about how the peace in Europe should look like, how we make perhaps in long term a kind of the peace agreement between in Ukraine and Russia, and how we don't forget this kind of global, because of this authoritarian contestation, all kind of things, it's going on completely in a direction that it's undermining on this kind of inclusive civil society engagement, because authoritarian regimes are offering their own understanding of peace, own understanding conflict. It's kind of very much starting from securing the state, not looking for the civil society and giving them the voice. And this is the danger what I'm seeing and is going on at the moment.
Thank you, Marko. Thank you, Lisa, as well, for excellent comments, excellent interventions. I think we should wrap up here. It's been confirmed that we should wrap up. We're having lunch, if I'm not mistaken. Right? I don't know where.